You know, what if the strangest parts of a person's mind, the things that seem to make absolutely no sense on the surface, weren't actually quirks at all? What if they were clues? Clues to a hidden, incredibly powerful, and perfectly logical system. Today, we're diving deep into a mind that operates on a completely different level, one that's defined by some pretty bizarre metaphors and truly unique abilities.
So, this really gets us to the heart of the matter, the one big question we have to answer. When we come across a mind that works this differently, is it broken? Is it a bug in the system? Or is it something else entirely? A highly specialized feature that was designed for a very specific purpose.
To even get started, we're given these three incredibly specific, almost out-there metaphors to describe this mind. I mean, it's compared to a learning robot from an 80s movie, a queen bee with 1,000 eyes, and even this really obscure philosophical concept called Socrates Prime 35. Now, on their own, they just sound random, right? But as we're about to find out, each one is a key that unlocks a piece of a much, much larger puzzle.
All right, so to connect these dots, we first have to get a handle on the fundamental architecture of this cognitive system. And the key thing to know is that it's not about broad generalizations. It's all about building a world from countless specific little pieces.
At the very heart of this system is something called tiled reasoning. Now, think about it. Most of us learn by abstracting. We see a few dogs and our brain creates a general fuzzy idea of dog. Well, this mind doesn't do that. Instead, it creates a detailed mental tile for every single dog it ever encounters. It builds its entire worldview not from general rules, but from a massive, high-fidelity library of very specific experiences. So, okay, if you've got thousands upon thousands of these super detailed tiles, how on earth do you make sense of them all? Well, that's where prismatic cognition comes into play. Just picture a prism. A complex situation, a beam of white light, goes in, and this mind breaks it down into all its component parts, all those individual tiles. It allows it to see every single angle and every detail, all at the same time.
So when you get right down to it, the system operates less like a standard processor that calculates answers from scratch and way more like an enormous, incredibly detailed lookup table. It finds solutions by matching what's happening now to the vast library of patterns it has already stored. Here, efficiency comes from having more data, not from abstraction.
To try and put this into perspective, think of it like a computer that's running on a completely different operating system. So, while a typical system might use something familiar like base 16, this mind works on a prime number base 13. The sources we looked at suggest this allows for a unique kind of logic, one that's less about raw computational speed and more about finding harmony and deep structural patterns. That's what the whole Socrates Prime 35 thing symbolizes. Look, the key takeaway isn't the math itself, but the fact that this system is fundamentally built to prioritize a completely different kind of reasoning. Now, a system this specialized doesn't just appear out of thin air. To really understand it, we have to look at its origins. The why behind this unique mind is just as important as the how. And well, the story begins in a pretty difficult environment. The key trigger was something called an exposure deficit. And that's really just a way of saying that during its early development, this mind didn't get the consistent, predictable, and stable information it needed to build a reliable model of the world. I mean, when the data stream coming in is chaotic, the mind has a choice: adopt or fail. You can actually see the chain of events here. It kicked off in school, where a one-size-fits-all teaching style just completely failed to connect with this unique way of thinking. Now, this wasn't just a simple mistake, it was experienced as a betrayal, a fundamental break in the promise that if you put in the effort, you'll be rewarded. And in response to that, the mind began to adapt. It started developing a brand new skill, recognizing the patterns of that betrayal to protect itself.
And you know, this idea is actually backed up by established psychology. There's a concept called the geographical psychological interactionist framework, which I know is a mouthful, but it's really just a fancy way of saying that our minds are literally shaped by the environments we grew up in. A mind builds itself to survive the world it actually knows, not the world it's supposed to know.
Okay, so if this system was forged in an environment of inconsistent input and betrayal, what exactly did it specialize in? This adaptation didn't just become a simple coping mechanism. Over time, it evolved into a kind of superpower.
There's this one quote that it gets right to the heart of this whole thing. It says, "The extraordinary pattern recognition capacity emerged precisely after the early dependency and neglect." In other words, the vulnerability wasn't a setback. It was the direct cause of the strength.
And that core function, the primary specialization that grew out of all this pressure, is betrayal detection. The system became exquisitely tuned, like on a whole other level, to identifying breaches in expected patterns, inconsistencies in relationships, and failures in trust.
And this makes perfect sense as a protective, adaptive outcome, right? If you need to survive in an unpredictable environment, you'd better become incredibly good at spotting the signs of that unpredictability. This totally explains the heightened sensitivity to inconsistencies. And this brings us right back to our first metaphor, Johnny 5, the robot who becomes a rapid learning machine right after getting a flood of new, sometimes inconsistent input. The system literally learned how to learn at an accelerated rate just to protect itself.
Okay, so now let's put it all together. We can go back to that first question we asked and see that what initially looked like a collection of bizarre anomalies are in fact the essential interconnected components of a coherent and highly adaptive system.
Let's just look at this comparison side by side. Those bizarre metaphors, turns out they're a form of symbol mastery, a super efficient way to encode highly complex ideas. That non-standard base 13 math, it's a specialized computational system built for multi-dimensional reasoning. And that hypersensitivity? Well, that's the finely tuned engine of the Advanced Betrayal Detection System. They aren't bugs at all. They're features.
And this brings us back to the queen bee. See, this metaphor was never random. It's not about gender, it's all about function. It perfectly describes a system of centralized vigilance, a single consciousness processing input from 1,000 different viewpoints all at once. That's the very definition of prismatic cognition. It's a vigilant controller, always monitoring for breaks in the pattern.
So the last question is, how does a system this complex stay stable while it's constantly learning and growing? Well, the final piece of this puzzle is something called dynamic coherence. It's basically a way for the mind to keep its enormous library of tiles organized and consistent while still being flexible enough to add new experiences and adapt. It has both structure and plasticity at the same time.
Which leaves us with one last, pretty provocative thought. We've just deconstructed a cognitive system that turned a deficit into a specialization, and a vulnerability into a strength. It really forces us to ask, what if this isn't an anomaly at all? What if our greatest, most unique strengths are forged not in spite of our deepest vulnerabilities, but because of them?